Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'll teach you the Horsefly Defense, an opening almost no one knows and almost no one plays. It's a defense you can employ against the bird's opening and an idea you can play against the Dutch defense as well. It's playing knight h6 on move 1 against f4. Now this may seem like a weird move, but it's a perfectly sound defense. Black is slightly better in most lines, and there are very specific strategic ideas with this move. I'm going to show you the lines that are relevant to the bird. But in order for us to understand the move knight h6, we first have to reverse the board and look at the Dutch defense. So when white plays d4 and c4 and goes for the main lines, if black chooses to play the stone wall with either c6 or d5, then black has an issue. Black has an issue because this bishop will be great on d6, but this bishop will be awful. So we can play the move knight f3, for example, and after e6, the main strategic goal for white here should be to trade this bishop off, leaving black with this stupid bishop on c8. It's precisely because of that after bishop d6, most people with white play the move b3. And now a very well-known strategic blunder is to castle. I have won tournament games like this, I have won training games like this. The idea is, after castles, we go bishop a3. We do everything we can to exchange this bishop, leaving white basically a piece down until this very complex maneuver happens, and it doesn't have to happen. The alternative to exchanging the bishop with b3 and bishop a3 is to play knight h3. Does it look familiar? It's the same idea. So against the stone wall, people usually play the move knight h3 with the same strategic goal in mind, trading off these bishops. So after e6, white castles, and after bishop d6, white's most common move is bishop f4. So the first point we need to know about the horsefly defense, knight h6, is that it makes the stone wall setup almost unplayable from a strategic standpoint. That doesn't mean much when people my level play. Of course, anyone can win regardless of whether you trade off their only good piece or not. But it's strategically suspect to go for the stone wall when people play knight h6. Now, what happens if white just plays normal moves? The horsefly defense has some specific ideas in mind, and most of all, you are playing against slow moves and you are playing against the stone wall. So you have an improved stone wall and an improved setup if white plays slowly. Now, many people with white, as you could have seen in my video on the bird opening, play the bird to get a Dutch in reverse. If they want to get a Dutch in reverse, you are going to have to play d5. My recommendation against most normal moves white can play, such as knight f3, where they either go for the Leningrad or the classical or the stone wall, is to play the reverse Dutch. And we go d5. After d5, we are now transposing to normal f4 d5 lines, but we have a knight on h6, which is a perfectly reasonable option, a perfectly reasonable continuation in those variations. So g6, for example, bishop g2, bishop g7, castles. And this you can get via the d5 or the knight h6 move order. I would recommend that you go for this because black is simply slightly better and the positions are extremely easy to play. This knight on h6, when white doesn't play the stone wall, will not serve to trade off the bishop on d3 because there is no bishop on d3. So the knight can go to f5 in some cases, challenging d4 and e3, sometimes coming back to d6. And this pattern is something you should remember. If white ever plays the move d4, then getting this knight into d5 would be similar to what you do when you have a knight on f6. If you at some point play the move knight f5, please remember to play it in a position where your e-pawn has moved, so that on the move g4, you don't have to retreat or go to d6, you have the option to go knight h4. I think that's very important, and this is a pattern I very commonly see in the Caro-Kann advanced variation. Now this may not seem too relevant to you if you don't play the Caro-Kann, but have a look at this position. So in many cases, I'm not saying you should go knight h6 here, it's a weird move, but when you get a position like this in the advanced Caro-Kann, and you could, if white ever plays g4, black's best move by far is to go knight h4. Again, I hope you recognize the similarity here. If g4, you want to go knight h4. So if you want to go knight f4, knight f5, excuse me, prepare that by opening up your queen or your bishop if you play with the bishop on e7. Now, let's have a look at the critical moves. Knight f3 will transpose to the reverse Dutch, but there are three moves we have to examine very carefully. b3, e4, and d4. One other move that we have to mention is e3, but that will just transpose to the classical Dutch, very similar to what we were looking at a second ago, except that white isn't playing a Leningrad with g3, bishop g2, but instead plays bishop e2, or plays d4 at some point and plays the stone wall. Against this, the horsefly defense is best if you go d5, knight f3, and g6. You play your same setup. d4, this is the stone wall. We know what to do. If you remember this position we looked at a second ago, when white plays against the stone wall in the main line Dutch, white plays knight h3 to play bishop f4. And in this case, once bishop d3 happens, we now go bishop f5. It's a completely identical position, except that black has not played c5 because black didn't start with the white pieces. So let's look at the slow b3 first. Now the Nimzo Larsen and the bird are the same opening if a player chooses to play both moves. The move order is very relevant, and some positions like starting with f4 don't really allow e5 unless you want to go into the From's Gambit. But if you start with f4 and play the move b3, e5, the From's Gambit on steroids, becomes much stronger. Here is why. White faces the same issues they do in the normal From's Gambit. You could go e4 technically, transposing to a weird king's gambit or whatever. It's no good. The best move is to take on e5. And if you know the From's Gambit, you will know that on f4, e5 takes, d6 is the most common move. Now, when we do the same thing with d6, with knight h6 and b3 thrown in, e takes is unplayable. E takes d6 compared to the normal From's Gambit is losing here. Why? Because in the From's Gambit, what we do when we play d6 and allow e d6, bishop d6, is we play for queen h4, bishop g3. Now that's usually prevented with the move knight f3, but in this case that doesn't work because we have another attacker. So we go knight g4, and now we're threatening not queen h4 because there's a knight on f3, but bishop takes. And if white plays a normal move, let's say bishop b2, then bishop takes h2 is just game over. I mean, I don't know what you're supposed to do here. I'm going to play bishop g3, threatening checkmate. So you have to move your e pawn or your d pawn. If you take, obviously, that's no good. So, you know, that doesn't work. So on d6, e takes d6 cannot be played. White has to do something else. White's best move, people have tried e6, which is weird. White's best move is e3. And after e3, we just recapture the pawn, maybe bishop b2. You can play knight c6 or bishop d6. I prefer bishop d6. And now imagine that you're playing against the Nimzo Larsen, trying to hold on to this e5 pawn, knight c3, for example. c6 preventing knight d5 and knight b5. And the game goes on. If you turn on the engine, it will say that black has a slight advantage, so you're not risking anything, even if white knows what they are doing. The two critical moves are e4 and d4. We are taught to claim the center, and if white goes f4 and you play knight h6, not preventing e4 or d4, then obviously those are the two principled moves. d4, I think, is very pleasant for black. This is the best move for white according to the engine. This is the best way to continue against the Horsefly defense, and it's completely equal. I would recommend the move d5 here, fighting against e4 and playing for the e4 square. Now, as you can see, this knight on h6 is perfectly placed, because in order to challenge the f5 square, white will now have to play the move g4. So remember the idea of playing knight f5 when you have knight h4. And the e4 square is up for grabs, so we wish that our knight was back on f6 in this particular case. So again, remember this idea, playing for e4. The game could continue knight f3, g6, e3, bishop g7. Once again, if bishop d3, remember our stonewall idea. c4 should be the best move for white, not c3. Maybe c6 or e6. e6 is better. Bishop e2, knight f5, sorry, not bishop f5, and now g4. And you can see that since the knight is on f5 and the queen has been opened, we could now go knight h4. And again, this is similar to the advanced Caro-Kann. Just look at the structure. So against d4, I would recommend d5, and you are going to have fewer weaknesses and the more solid pawn structure. You don't have to shut in your bishop with e6 here. It's just the best way to play. You could go c6 as well and play for bishop f5. And finally, e4. Now, e4, there is a way to punish f4, e4 in the Sicilian Grand Prix, in the McDonald attack, in the birds opening. It's always the same. Against e4, black goes d5, equalizing easily. Now, with the knight on h6, believe it or not, most people on leeches are going to blunder the exact same way and get an almost unplayable position. That happens after e5. e5 is a blunder. You're not losing material, but look at this square. After e5, black should go c5. The center is now shut in the center and on the king side. d5 will never be a problem pawn. We are going to continue with knight c6, challenging these squares with the bishop, or playing the knight into those squares and simply have a great position. If knight f3, knight c6, most people on leeches actually play bishop b5 here, because, I mean, bishop e2 makes no sense, bishop d3 also doesn't make sense. So bishop b5 is a sensible move. However, bishop b5 is a blunder. Black goes bishop d7, a counterintuitive slow move, but white has nothing better but to exchange the knight on c6 now. That's by far the best move. If white castles, white is losing. Knight takes e5, the bishop is hanging. And once you recapture, I take back with the knight, and I'm simply up a pawn. The same goes for any other sensible move. c3, knight takes. Once again, the bishop is hanging. So you have to either play a4, which is weird, but a4 is bad all the same, because if you take the bishop now, I'm fighting for e5, you have a pawn on a4, my knight's coming to f5, I've gotten rid of my light squared bishop, so I can safely play e6 and bishop d6. Very, very pleasant. So on e4, d5, white should not go e5. What should white do? Well, white's best is to take on d5. We recapture with the queen. White will normally play knight c3, attacking the queen Scandinavian style. And now queen a5. Again, borrowing from the Scandinavian defense, pinning the knight in the event of d3 or d4. So for example, knight f3, g6, bishop c4, bishop to g7. Watch out as white don't castle here. Queen c5 check wins the bishop. So queen e2 maybe. Something like that. c5 followed by castles. Knight c6. Very, very pleasant. Normal position. White basically wishes that this pawn was back on f2. There's no reason to have a pawn on f4 here. So the Horsefly Defense is an extremely exciting opening. And I have to say, I'm looking forward to seeing f4 played against me next time. This is an opening almost no one plays, a defense that's virtually unknown. If you have any input on this, please let me know in the comments. I hope this helped, and I will see you in the next one. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.